Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series in the 1996 duel between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue, the supercomputer from IBM. I think this is one of the best games of the series. Definitely one I think you're going to learn a ton. If you watch these videos and you enjoy them, that's great. But if you're someone that watches these and you learn a lot just from the analysis and the commentary, I think this one is going to go above and beyond as far as learning from a famous chess game, which this is. So if you do recall, Game 1 was taken by the supercomputer Deep Blue. Game 2, Garry Kasparov came back and kicked the crap out of Deep Blue to tie it up 1-1. Games 3 and 4 actually both ended in a draw, which brings us to game number 5. White's going to be played by the supercomputer Deep Blue, and Black's going to be played by Garry Kasparov. Now, do keep in mind that game 6 is the last game. So there's only 2 more games, game 5 and 6. So both sides right now are tied in points. Garry Kasparov knows that, and he also knows that game 6 he's going to be playing the white pieces. So early on, you're going to see he's going to play a very defensive game. He has no problem tying and drawing this game because he knows going into game 6, if he can pull out a victory, then he's going to win the whole thing. And he's going to have a much easier time winning as white than he would as black. And it's going to be very, very difficult for him not to at least draw in game 6 with white pieces. So do keep that in mind. Obviously, Garry Kasparov is one of the greatest tactical players ever to play the game. But early on, you do see a very I don't want to say passive, but very defensive defense. So do keep that in mind, but we'll go ahead and get started into the game. Deep Blue, white starts out with pawn to e4, and Garry Kasparov defends with pawn to e5. Play continues with knight to f3. Simple development move, trying to control the center of the board. Typically, knights are going to be coming out before bishops as far as development. Always want to be developing your minor pieces towards the center. Garry Kasparov plays knight to f6. This is the Petrov defense, but it's going to shift into the 4 knights defense, as you'll see. White now plays knight to c3, and black's going to respond with knight to c6. Now, do keep in mind, obviously, there are tons and tons of famous games out there with top-level players, and you can kind of go into databases and see what percentage white wins, what percentage black wins, what percentage you actually draw in these high-level games. For the 4 knights game, which this defense is, there's actually a 68% chance that Garry Kasparov is either going to tie or win the game as black. So again, he has no problem obviously winning, but even so, a tie, that's fantastic news for him. So he definitely found a defense that, overall, this is going to be very, very safe for him. He can't get into a lot of troubles. There's not a lot of crazy tactical lines that he has to be worried about. So he's going to play very safe and just see what the computer gives to him. So just keep that in mind. From here, white's going to continue with pawn to d4, starting to put up his pawns, trying to put a little pressure on the center of the board. Black's going to take back, and then white's going to take back with his knight here on d4. And then black's going to bring his bishop down to b4. Now, typically you're going to bring one of your knights into the game, and then you're going to develop those other pieces, minor or major, depending on which side you want to castle. And you typically want to castle as soon as possible. In this particular case, black's going to bring his bishop out here to b4, pinning down this knight to c3. A lot of times you'll see bishops coming out to actually pin down this knight to either the king or the queen, depending on where it is. If it's here on f3, it'll be pinned down to the queen. So black's going to be ready to castle on the king side very, very soon. Now from here, white's going to go ahead and take this knight right here on c6. And black has 2 different options. He can retake with his pawn here on c6, or he can take with his pawn here on d6. Now, do keep in mind, he does have the option to take it with d6, but it's going to be a little bit tougher for him. White can always come and exchange queens, and then the king comes here and he can no longer castle. Now, it's not as risky to not castle if your opponent's queen is off the board. He doesn't have as many weapons to actually attack your uncastled king, but still, it's much easier to develop your pieces, to connect your rooks, and go into a middle game and subsequently a better end game if you do castle. So for this particular reason, Black decided to capture with his pawn here on c6, and then white played bishop to d3. Again, we already talked about, white wants to make sure that he's developing his pieces. He already has his knight out. Now he's developing his light square bishop so that he can castle on the king side and get that king side safety before he really starts to develop the rest of his pieces and plan some sort of attack. Now, white did have a few other options as far as where he could bring his bishop, but just to kind of go over a few of those, he's definitely not going to be bringing it to a6. That's a bad move. b5 is going to be losing it as well. Sometimes you may see the bishop come here to c4, going to be attacking this f7 square, which is a huge weakness for black early on. If you've been watching any of the videos, you know why. He could bring it here to e2, but this does kind of block off some of the protection on the e4 square. He has to keep in mind that this knight here on c3, which is the current defender of the pawn here on e4, is being pinned down. So definitely wants to make sure this knight can always come to e4 and capture. And right now, white cannot recapture because the knight's pinned down. So definitely wants to make sure he develops this light square bishop, but also is defending this pawn on e4. Now, in the early game, you want your minor pieces to be defending your pawns, making sure that your pawns are very strong in the center of the board, controlling a lot of the board. As you shift into the mid game, as we'll see in this particular game, you want your pawns protecting your pawns, and you want your minor pieces and your major pieces starting to attack. When you get into the mid game and the late game, you definitely don't want all your pieces tied down to defending your pawns. That's definitely not what they need to be doing. They need to be focusing on attacking or developing a plan to destroy your opponent. So for now, this is completely fine. Definitely want to make sure that early game you're defending your pawns as best as possible. From here, black's going to push down with pawn to d5. Black does have doubled pawns right here, but he's going to make it very easy for himself. After white takes on d5, he's just going to come back here to d5, and he no longer has those doubled pawns there on the c. So as most games I go over, you're typically going to see both high-level players developing their pieces, not overextending too much, castling to make sure they have kingside safety. So that's exactly what we are going to continue to see from both players. So Deep Blue decides to castle on the king side. Garry Kasparov, same thing with the black pieces, is going to castle on the king side as well. And now white's going to bring his bishop to g5. This is his last minor piece, getting it involved into the game. Obviously, pinning down this knight on f6 to the queen here on d8. So definitely a nice development move from him. Next, all he needs to do is get this queen involved into the game, connect the rooks. You always want to make sure you connect your rooks. And then white will pretty much complete the development that he has. Now from here, black's going to play pawn to c6. Black really has two options. He can bring his bishop over here to b7. He does need to keep in mind that his king, white's king, is no longer, calls for worry for this knight here on c3. This knight is no longer pinned down. So this knight, if he wanted to, can now come to d5 at any given time. So eventually, black wants to make sure that this pawn is protected as much as possible. He can either protect it with the bishop here on b7, or he can protect it with his pawn here on c6. Now, again, as we start to move towards the mid game, you typically are going to see pawns protecting pawns, and minor pieces actually starting to do work. So that's exactly what Garry Kasparov does. Instead of protecting with his bishop, he decides to move forward with his pawn, protecting this, making a nice little solid structure of the pawns, and it's also going to block off a lot of escape routes for this knight here on c3. So this knight can no longer take. He can no longer come to b5, it's being protected. He can no longer come to e4. So definitely a nice move to come to c6, and that's kind of why he did that. So white's now going to bring his queen to f3, completing development here. And then black's going to bring his bishop back to e7. Now that the knight is no longer pinned down, he wants to make sure that he has enough defenders on this knight on f6. As we can see, the bishop could always come, take here. And if the bishop wasn't here, you definitely don't want to have another doubled pawn here on the f-file. And if the queen were to come down, that's exactly what would happen after the exchange. So to mitigate that, the bishop's just going to come back here to e7. Now if we pause and look at this, if we look at both sides, you can see kind of a distinction between both. So we're approaching equality White pretty much has all his pieces developed. So all of his minor pieces, major pieces, he's castled on the king side. Both of his rooks are connected, so this is very, very good for him. If we look at black, he still has to develop his major piece queen here. The light square bishop currently is not doing a whole heck of a lot. Granted, he can get that involved very, very easy. So as far as development, black is actually behind, but what he lacks in development, he has a strong center control. White has lost both his D pawn and E pawn. Very important in the game. You always want to control the center of the board, typically with your pawns if possible, especially early on. So black definitely has a strong center control, which is very, very important. So although black does not have all his pieces developed, he still has reached equality because he has most of his pieces and he does have some center control. So a few things to keep in mind anytime you're analyzing the board, trying to figure out who's ahead at the current time. Just a few things to look at. We'll continue with the game. White plays rook to e1. Anytime there's an open file, you want your rooks on those open files, so that's exactly what black does as well. And now white's going to bring his knight back to e2. As we talked about, there's not really anything that white can do here. There's no really great moves or initiative that he has, but he definitely wants to make sure that his knight's in a better place. As we talked about, can't come to b5. Can't come to a4. I guess it could, but you never really want to have your knight on the edge, and a knight on the rim is brim. So he's not going to be doing a whole lot of good. So sometimes you have to move backwards before you can move forwards in chess. So the knight's going to come back to e2 so that he can position it somewhere else. Whether that be g3, could always be f4, d4, depending on what the defense gives him. He has a lot more places he can move around. Right now, he just can't move anywhere. So knight's going to come back to e2, and then black's going to play pawn to h6. Really a thorn in the side of black to have this bishop just pinning down the knight. High level play, you're typically not going to see bishops traded off. Because games can be open so easily, bishop pairs just dominate an open game, especially at high level. So the bishop's just going to come back, not going to exchange, and then the bishop's going to come to d6. Garry Kasparov decides that he wants to go ahead and exchange those pieces off, and that's fine. And now the knight's going to come to d4. There's no reason to go ahead and exchange right here. Kind of gives Garry Kasparov a little bit more initiative. His queen would be here on d6. No reason to kind of give an extra move to Garry Kasparov. Instead, he decides to bring his knight to d4. Much better square than it was here on c3. Now black's going to bring his bishop down to g4. Not only is he trying to complete his development, but also gaining tempo, forcing this queen to move. The queen's now going to come back over to g3. Definitely wants to protect this bishop here on f4, and also wants to attack this bishop here on g4. And now the bishop's just going to exchange off after the queen takes. Then the queen's going to come back over to b6. This is a great development square. As we've talked about, black definitely wants to make sure he finishes his development. His last piece to finish his development was his queen here on b6. This is not only getting it involved into the game, but it's also attacking this pawn here on b2. And it's attacking this knight here on d4. So really, really good square for the queen there on b6. White now plays pawn to c4, and a lot of times I analyze a lot of games from players, and anytime there's a pawn exchange, it is immediately take, and they would, in this particular case, take here. You definitely have to keep in mind that you have strengths and weaknesses. Right now, strength from black is he has center control of the board. There's no reason you kind of lose some of your initiative and your advantage if, let's say, the pawn takes, and now the bishop can retake here on c4. Now white starts to have a little bit more control of the center of the board. Black now has this pawn here on the c file that's not really controlling the center. And now it kind of starts to slip away from black. So there's no reason to go ahead and take this. Black's just going to continue moving his pieces, but not really worrying about this pawn here on c4. If white wants to exchange, black has no problem having a pawn here on d5 that's a passed pawn now. So just keep that in mind. Black's going to play bishop back to d6. If we look at this, white with his knight here on d4 is attacking this pawn here on c6. So anytime he wants to get his queen involved into the game, he has to know that this pawn is being attacked. So this queen back here on g4 is no longer attacking the queen. it's developed, so you can kind of come back and kind of protect this pawn in the meantime before he wants to get it back involved into the game. White's now going to play pawn takes on d5, and black's going to gladly take back. And from here, black has a passed pawn on the d file. This is going to be very, very good for black. And it's going to be very difficult for white because it's just going to be a huge thorn in your side knowing that your opponent has a passed pawn in the center of the board, and you're going to have to worry about that because if that passes, you know, he's obviously going to get a queen or potentially another piece depending on, you know, how he wants to destroy you. So white's now going to play rook takes on e8. Black's going to come back and take. So right now black owns this e file. White's now going to White's going to bring his queen back to d2, and the bishop's now going to come, the knight's going to come back to e4, attacking this queen here on d2. Now the bishop's going to take, pretty much forcing the hand, which is exactly what black wanted. And this is an important note to talk about it. If you've seen the other videos, you kind of know this point, but when you approach the end game, if you kind of look at the minor pieces, there's strengths and weaknesses. If there's two sets of pawn chains, so in this case there's a pawn chain over here, a pawn island if you will, there's pawn chains on this side of the board, so there's two different sides of the board. Bishops do much better because they can get to both sides of the board very, very quickly. If there's just one side of the board, if we took, you know, the A pawns off and this B pawn off and there were just pawns on one side, knights actually do pretty well because they can maneuver. They don't have to travel all over the board, so knights are going to do better. In this particular case, bishops are going to outperform knights because there's two pawn islands. So Garry Kasparov definitely knew this, and he decided, hey, I have an opportunity to exchange my knight for their bishop heading into the endgame. This is going to be very, very good for me. So even in your own game, if you're trying to figure out, hey, should I exchange this knight or this bishop, just know it really depends on how many pawn islands you have on the board. So side note, but definitely good for anyone trying to improve their chess game, a tidbit that you definitely want to incorporate into your own game. Play continues with pawn to b3. Wants to solidify this pawn structure here over on the queen side. There's not a lot of pieces. Definitely wants to make sure that this pawn right here on b3 and a2 are kind of taking care of themselves. Doesn't really have to tie any other resources down to protecting those. Garry Kasparov's now going to bring his rook over to d8. In this particular situation, Garry Kasparov actually offered a draw to Deep Blue and the Deep Blue team. And Deep Blue actually declined the draw. So they actually thought that they not only had a winning position, but would actually win the game. They didn't even think they would draw this. So I find that very interesting. Obviously, there is more time in the video, so you know that it does go on. And Garry Kasparov ends up winning. So I just find that very interesting that they would actually take this position, which I actually think is winning for Garry Kasparov, as we talked about with the bishop and the knight here. And they actually declined that. So definitely a game changer, you know, going into game number 6. It may have changed a little bit as far as the preparation. Garry Kasparov could have then played for the draw. So just a fun fact as we kind of continue in this game. This particular situation, Garry Kasparov offered a draw and it was declined. Black's going to play pawn to f5. Now again, as we talked about, this pawn here on e5, you want to be protecting it if possible with other pawns. So black starts to smell some fear here, so he's going to start to push forward and see if he can put a lot of pressure on white. White's going to respond with rook to d1. Definitely wants to make sure that he doesn't concede this open d file now. Obviously the e file is a semi-open file, so wants to make sure he gets it involved into the open file. Black's going to play bishop to e6. Wants to make sure he's still protecting this pawn here on f5 with his bishop, but also wants to make sure that he has full access with his rook here on d8. So really, with all these small little moves, just trying to increase his advantage, get all of his pieces involved into the game, working together, and that's exactly what he does. It's really interesting that Garry Kasparov just completely tactically outplayed a supercomputer, since that's exactly what they're supposed to be good at. That's exactly what Garry Kasparov outplayed him at. So very, very interesting. White's now going to play queen to e3. Again, there's a discovered attack on the queen if this knight moves, so just a heads up there. Now the bishop's going to come back to f7. And white's now going to play the queen back to c3, and then black's going to start to push forward, putting a lot of pressure, again, as we talked about, on the king side. And white decides to bring his rook up to d2. Again, there's just so much pressure on white. He's going to have to play really, really well to stop all the attacks from black. Now, play continues with the black queen coming over to f6. Want to make sure he's protecting this pawn here on f4. He's going to start pushing, so he wants to make sure he has all his pieces ready. Now the pawn's going to come up to d3, trying to put some counter attack here on this f4 square. Rook's now going to come down to d5, and the pawn's going to come to a3. Now, the pawn to a3, to me, is kind of a question mark. Doesn't really do a whole lot of good. White really needs to be improving his position a little bit more. I don't really know what he's trying to accomplish with pawn to a3. Seems like a questionable call to me, but supercomputer tactically is supposed to be really good, so I'm sure the computer saw something that I did not. From here, the king's going to come over to h7. Garry Kasparov has full intent to start to trade down and get into an endgame. Once you approach the endgame, your king becomes a very, very valuable asset, and you want to make sure he's involved into the game. So, with that said, the king's now going to be coming to h7, eventually to g6, to f5. Wants to make sure that he's centralized so he can join the fight once pieces start to fall off the board. Now the white king comes to g2, which he's starting to think the exact same thing. But this in particular is probably a bad move. I would have liked to see something like h3, and then he could have always brought his king over to h2. I think that would have been better than king to g2. Just doesn't do a whole lot of good for him. But that's what he decided to play. Now black's going to play queen to e5, putting a lot more pressure. Now also defending this pawn here on f4, but also attacking this diagonal, and then starting to open up the door for this king to get involved into the game. So the pawn's now going to come to f3, and Garry Kasparov decides, I'm not even going to exchange. Instead, I'm going to start to push forward, which anytime you have a passed pawn, passed pawns were meant to be pushed. So if you're ever looking at a game and you have a passed pawn and you're like, man, I just have no clue what the crap I'm supposed to do, just push your passed pawn. Good things will happen. So that's exactly what happens. From here, white plays rook to d3. The pawn is just continue to be pushed. White decides to go ahead and take on f4, attacking the queen. Garry Kasparov does not care at all. He's going to continue to push. Comes down, promotes to a queen. After the exchange here, he's going to come back, take the queen. After the rook takes, he's going to take the rook here on d4. So as you can see, a couple things. Obviously, white has more pawns. He has 2 more pawns, but white has not only a bishop, but he has the most powerful minor piece going into the endgame. Again, 2 pawn islands. Definitely going to be a lot stronger with the bishop because it can just move all over the place. Now, best case scenario, which Garry Kasparov is going to try to get to, is if he can take off these rooks. This is pretty much the last threat that white has. So if he can get these, he can pretty much move all over the game and just gobble up pawns if he wants to. It's going to be virtually impossible for white to stop the onslaught of a bishop from Garry Kasparov. So white now plays pawn to b4, and black plays a very important move, and he plays bishop to c4. Now if you look at it, he wants to immobilize this rook as much as possible. Again, this is the last hope for white, and that's exactly what bishop to c4 does. This stops this rook from moving past the 4th rank. He can no longer do anything productive. And this is going to also make it a lot easier for Garry Kasparov to exchange off the rooks off the board. So very, very important move. This small little bishop to c4, very, very good move leading into the endgame, which obviously, as we talked about, is going to be very, very easy for Garry Kasparov to win. We'll go ahead and finish up the game here. The king's going to come to f2. Wants to make sure that he tries to get that king involved into the game, centralize it a little bit more. Black's going to bring his pawn over to g5. Wants to push a little bit further before he gets his king involved into the game. The white rook's going to come over to e3, trying to really escape, but there's really not a lot of action that he can do. But in this particular case, wants to go ahead and bring his rook behind this passed pawn that he has here on e5. Make sure that if there is any potential, he can kind of push that forward. Black's going to kind of thwart that. He's going to bring his bishop back to e6, stopping this pawn from being pushed any further. The rook's going to come back to c3, trying to get out there, and the bishop's going to come back to c4. Now, when the rook comes back to e3, Garry Kasparov is now going to bring his rook, kind of an in-between move. He's going to check the king here on f2, and then the king's going to come back here to e1. From here, the rook's going to come up to d3, trying to exchange off these rooks right here. He knows going into the endgame he has a much favorable position, so if he can go ahead and exchange off these last rooks on the board, it's going to be an easy win for Garry Kasparov. Now the white king is going to come back to f2. Black decides to go ahead and centralize his king a little bit before he does exchange these pieces off. So the rooks are going to come off the board. The white king is now going to come to e3. The bishop comes back to c2. More centralization from both squares. And then Garry Kasparov plays pawn to h5 and white resigns. Now if you kind of look at it, if you're not too familiar with why people resign, if you look at this, Garry Kasparov has this light squared bishop here on c2. At any time, he could always bring it to b3, cutting off this e6 square. But more importantly, anytime he wants, he can always bring this bishop to a4, attacking and protecting the square on e8. If he ever wanted to, he could always, bring it here and bring it back to g6 if he really had to, if the king started to get involved and started attacking that bishop. But there's no way. He can always exchange this bishop for this pawn. It really doesn't matter for black because the king can now come down to f4. He can go ahead and start gobbling up all these pieces. If the if the white king tries to kind of hold on to these, then Bobby Fischer can just chase him around the board with the bishop, and then he can go ahead and gobble up this pawn here on e5. So it's going to be virtually impossible. Garry Kasparov just has an overwhelming advantage, and there's no way for white to really continue and not lose this game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. There's a ton of fantastic material to learn in this video, so hopefully you not only enjoyed watching it, but hopefully you actually learned something, can apply it to your own chess game, and you can actually see improvement in your own chess game. So definitely let me know what you guys think of the video, and I will see you guys in game number 6 in the 1996 series between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue.